Hi, I'm Scott Thrower from the Fairy Tales for Unwanted Children podcast, and I'm joined by Kristen Zaza from the On a Dark, Cold Night podcast, both on the Sonar Network. And today we're going to be telling a story working together where each of us is going to record our sections, pass it off to the other one to continue the story, and we'll see what we get up to by the end of it. And we're going to start first with Kristen, and I'm going to pass her a randomly generated word to see what she comes up with. And here it is. Headquarters. Good luck, Kristen.
Five figures sat around a table. The room was dark, too dark to be able to see what the walls looked like, and with the snow falling viciously fast outside of the window, and the moon so full and bright, the world outside of this secret, unknown room seemed to glow even more brightly than whatever was inside here. The five figures, you see, were happy with only the light of one candle shared between them, in the center of the table, just barely allowing them to see each other. That was how they liked it. The table itself was made of an ancient black marble, cracked, scratched, and imperfect in its timeless strength. In fact, it was hardly a table at all. It was a great, huge block of stone rooted into the ground. In fact, one could no longer tell where the ground began and where the table ended. In fact, this table had always been in this exact place. The house, the building, whatever the flimsy thing that sheltered these five figures in the storm was built around this marble table. It was hardly a table at all. It might have preferred that I call it an altar. And every year, at the time of year we have decided to call the end of the year, for no real reason and to no real relevance that the five figures could ever really understand, this group would meet again at this place, in this storm, at this table. Well, the eldest of the five said, grinning ear to ear, for even ancient and inhuman things can admit to feeling some comfort in routine and reunion. Here we are again.
For the last time, I hope. The youngest leaned forward, her hair falling down across her eyes. Lately she'd been calling herself Eleanor, though as one millennia ended and the next began, it had started sounding dated even to her. You've lost your taste for the work, the eldest replied. He'd never taken a name, human customs itched. You cannot rush divine machinations. One can, Eleanor replied, picking at a loose seam in her maroon glove. One just needs to choose to. With a sigh, she reached into her coat, pulling out a sheaf of pages and tossing them onto the center of the table. Their science is advancing. Unfolding protein structures changes the map. Tie it to the massive speeds coming from quantum computers, and the options available to us are few, and they grow fewer with every passing day. The others exchanged nervous glances, but the eldest merely shook his head, his smile not even flickering. We don't need those options, he said. Wipe them all away. There's only one path to watch now. Eleanor's brows knit together. So we're abandoning disease vectors entirely? Is it to be war? Why was I not told? The oldest shook his head. Play with your computers if you must. But don't get comfortable. I have set things in motion and you needn't bother yourself. It will come to pass. What will? Eleanor said, standing. We are meant to be working together. We are meant to be ending an infestation. The eldest stood, and as he did, the candle flickered, casting his shadow against the wall, a large, hulking shape unlike the man himself. But no need to be angry, Eleanor. After all, you'll like her. Her? Eleanor demanded as the eldest turned to walk away. Her, he replied. He paused at the door, looking back. She'll be 17 today, so we're ready to get started.
Happy birthday, then. The one who called himself Hector ever since he'd heard the name and fallen in love with it said. He had been sitting reclined in his chair as if it were a throne this entire time, and the other four around the table had taken notice. He had been idly braiding a piece of his long, white hair while the others had been speaking. He knew his cue when he saw it, however. I'll be off, then. At a casual nod from the eldest, Hector sighed, stood, and stretched. Finally, he closed his eyes and quickly clapped his hands together. With a loud crash of thunder that arrived with no trace of lightning, he disappeared in a cloud of yellow smoke. He was off to find her.
Jennifer slammed her locker door, but it didn't turn any heads like it once did. It just echoed up and down the empty hall. More than half of her class was attending from home these days, and most of those didn't even come out on weekends anymore. She caught sight of herself in the glass of the school's trophy case, not a single one more recent than 2004, and paused just long enough to make sure that her hair was falling just right. She needn't bother. Even Insta was dead these days. All the comments she was getting were about how she should be wearing a mask from people who wanted some sort of acknowledgement, even if that was just an argument. Honestly, it was exhausting to keep your numbers growing these days. And recently, she'd made the mistake of looking up some of her most frequent commenters. Well, let's just say they were followers for a reason.
Most were perfectly uninteresting. People who found Jennifer fascinating or infuriating or wonderful or despicable. None of them meant anything to her. For Jennifer, the only thing that mattered about them was how many of them there were. That was what followers were for to her, their multitude. But 5 followers who had commented were not cruel nor kind. They weren't really anything. All they wrote in their comment was simply a symbol, an arrow pointing down. These were the profiles she investigated now in this hallway. And their biographies in their profiles were almost entirely blank. No words, no links, only a number. Profile after profile contained only big, red, almost cartoonish numbers counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, Jennifer, a voice said in the hallway.
She turned. The hallway was almost empty, still a few minutes from the next bell. A man in a short trench coat was standing at the top of the stairs a good way off, in a wide stance as if he'd been waiting to be noticed. He was handsome, maybe even rugged, a dad type. But the long white hair was trying a bit too hard. He wasn't a teacher and there was no guest pass hanging around his neck. But he'd known her name. I'm flattered, she said, leaning a shoulder against the trophy case with an expression she hoped made her look icy. But I don't go anywhere near internet weirdo stalker guys. She shrugged and turned to leave, but paused. Something about the white hair was telling her he might have a following of his own, despite being at least 40. What's your Insta name? She turned back, almost bumping into his chest. She hadn't even heard him approach.
My Insta name, he repeated, as though the words were in a language that he did not really understand fully, and he did not. Social media, internet, communication in general, in fact, were not his arenas. I call myself Hector, but there are names others have saved just for me. Ultimately, none of them matter. For today, on this most auspicious of days, this most sacred and profane of days, birthday girl, he said, smirking. It is time for you to discover your new name." He stretched his neck back and forth, and the sound it made was like rotting wood being split by lightning. Chaos. Decay. "And then you'll really have a story to share with your followers. Let's hope they're ready."
"All that sounds great," Jennifer replied. "Really it does, but I have socially distant party plans and they're not that emo." She backed away hurriedly, confused by the sensation of him, the sudden smell of ozone and the way her hair was standing up on her arms. She turned and ran, wishing she'd picked today's shoes for function rather than look, but he caught up in 2 steps, grabbing her arm and twisting her. His smile widened until a laugh broke the mood. "Oh, Hector," Eleanor said from her seat atop the trophy case. "You're not quite in her demographic." His eyes darted up as his smile faded into a scowl. "How did you find us?" he demanded. "She's live streaming," Eleanor replied, flickering out and reappearing beside them. "I'm a big investor with Facebook. Finding teenagers is easy these days. It was a fallback in case the plague fell through."
Hector sneered at the intrusion. "You're awfully proud of your own resourcefulness, aren't you? Especially when I was the one specifically tasked to bring her back to headquarters. He won't like you going behind his back again." He looked down at Jennifer, then back to Eleanor. He easily took Jennifer's phone from her and let go of her arm, letting her fall to the ground. He deliberately dropped her phone. She cried out, horrified, and reached for it, but it was too late. Hector had made a spear from thin air, a sort of staff with a black blade at its tip. "Live streaming," he said, as though the words were poison in his mouth. And he brought his spear crashing down into the phone. Jennifer screamed, but not as loud as Hector screamed when he realized the phone did not break.
Jennifer snatched the phone up as the bell rang, happy to see that the screen hadn't shattered. Somehow that never happened to her. She kicked out at Hector's shin, but it was like kicking stone. He raised up the spear again, but Eleanor caught his hand. "I presume you're supposed to deliver her alive," Eleanor said, just as classroom doors opened, releasing an anemic stream of masked students to stare at the odd pantomime by the trophy case. Jennifer took advantage of the momentary distraction and ran as fast as her strappy wedges could take her, putting almost all her weight on the railing to avoid tumbling down the stairs as the awkward shoes threatened to snap her ankles. The phone kept buzzing in her hand as notifications piled up, almost as fast as the time she'd accidentally posted that photo the previous summer.
Hector and Eleanor now stood side by side in the hallway. A few students took notice of them, but it didn't really matter. The two of them would be out of sight and out of mind in no time, as they always were. They watched as Jennifer ran. "Do you think she knows?" Hector asked Eleanor. Despite their differences, after so many years, they were beyond animosity. Eleanor thought for a long moment. "Yes, I think somewhere deep down she does." The principal came out of her office and bounded toward the 2 strangely dressed, unmasked adults. Simultaneously, they turned their heads towards her, and with a single strike of his spear against the ground, Hector and Eleanor disappeared. Meanwhile, Jennifer descended a never-ending staircase, the notifications on her phone now so frequent that the buzzing became an eternal hum.
The screen kept flashing with each new contact. At first it seemed people were responding to her live stream, some saying ghastly things. But then strange characters started appearing, often in colors Jennifer was certain she'd never seen before. The device got hot in her hands. The staircase kept turning, but the doors to the lobby never appeared. Jennifer stumbled, twisting her ankle and falling to her hands and knees. The phone skittered out of her hand, landing screen up several feet away. Black. And then it began to ring. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
Where the name of the contact or phone number would normally be, Jennifer only saw the words "no caller ID." Yet in the circle where a little gray blank cartoon person should be in the place of a photograph, there was a symbol. The same symbol they kept commenting under her posts. An arrow pointing down. But this was no emoji. It was rather, perhaps, a photograph of a very old, ornate drawing. Maybe a wood carving, surrounded by strange sigils she knew she never saw before, but that Jennifer seemed to understand anyway. Hunter, shepherd, flock, food, hunger, harvest, feast. The veil was growing thinner, and the phone kept ringing. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, boo-dee-dee-dee-dee-da, ya-da-da-da-da-da-da. Hello? She answered.
"Jennifer, dear, there's something I need you to do for me," came the reply. It was like getting a call from your grandparents somehow. Even the voice sounded familiar, though Jennifer was quite certain she'd never heard it before. "It's time to come home now, sweetheart. I need you to bring everyone home." Jennifer swallowed hard, even as every hair on her arm stood up. "Do you hear me, pet? It's getting awfully late, and I need you to fetch them. Will you do that for me?" "Of course I will," Jennifer replied, but she hadn't meant to. She hadn't even realized she was saying the words until they were out past her lips.
"Good girl," the voice said lovingly. "I knew you wouldn't let us down. We'll see you soon. Very soon indeed." They hung up, and Jennifer, for the first time in what felt like hours, maybe even days somehow, reached the bottom of the never-ending stairwell. She knew now that she was no longer in the high school. Perhaps she had never been there. Maybe it never even really existed. Anything was possible, she thought to herself, as she was about to exit through the wooden door that had that elaborate arrow pointing down burned into its surface. It had somehow appeared. Before she pushed it open, she opened Instagram one last time. She had one more message for her followers. "Bring everyone home," she thought to herself, her brain seemingly hypnotized by that phrase. Bring everyone home.
Eleanor's phone vibrated in her hand, causing she and Hector to look down. "Huh," she said. "After all this time, the end is just the vibration of a phone." She looked up. Students were milling about, no care at all for social distancing, and one by one their phones chimed, beeped, or shook in their hands. Several already had their phones out, quickly checking on their way from one class to the next, and these were the ones affected first. They stopped in their tracks, forwarded the message on, and then slumped to the floor. Those who hadn't yet had their phones out responded to their first instincts. Something was going on with their classmates, and it needed to be documented. For YouTube, for TikTok, for the world. And when they got their phones out to find their camera apps, they each saw a message waiting to be read. Eleanor and Hector exchanged surprised glances as the second wave fell. "Even I have to admit it's efficient," she said. "Lacks a bit of that brimstone," he muttered, but he was already sweeping his long white hair back from his ears to listen to the most wonderful things. Car crashes, sirens, screams that abruptly cut off. The corner of Hector's mouth ticked up. But it'll do. The end. And that's our story, folks. Written over the course of 2 weeks with no plotting or planning. Thanks to the Sonar Podcast Network for the platform for this creative exercise. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Extra special thanks to the fantastic Kristen Zaza. Kristen is the writer, producer, and host of her own podcast, On a Dark, Cold Night, found here on the Sonar Network. I've been and will continue to be the lovely and talented host of Fairy Tales for Unwanted Children, Scott Thrower. On behalf of both of us, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you have a happy and deeply bizarre holiday. And above all else, I hope you stay healthy.
This podcast has been brought to you by the Sonar Network. Sonar.